Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the Whitwam Organics Weekly Garden Report. My name is David Whitwam, and I am your host. So today, after the report, we get to do something very exciting. One of my favorite things to do, especially when I go do school gardens and I'm working with school kids, but even adults really get into this. So today I got out my family's worm farm, and we are going to take it apart, and it should be a lot of fun. Let me just check on a few things really quick, and then we will get into this. Let me see here. Okay, so out in the nursery, things are actually going really well. I know it's been a lot hotter than I had expected, but we're not really seeing as much stress. I think there's that couple degrees of drop. I believe the wind is coming from like the east right now, a little bit northeast. So it's definitely not as hot and humid as when it was coming straight up from the south. Even just those couple of degrees make a big difference. I know I've been saying this for weeks, but if you look at the 2-week forecast, we finally have toward the end of the 2-week forecast around Halloween, we finally have the temperatures cooling down into like the 60s at night, and that's going to make a really big difference on how well everything is going. Out in my gardens, we're harvesting a ton of eggplants right now, cucumbers out of our ears, squash, zucchini. Yesterday at one of my gardens, I had to rip out, I think it was like 16 yellow squash plants because they got the mosaic virus. I had been monitoring it for the past couple of weeks, and one plant got it, we ripped it out. Then 2 plants got it, we ripped that out. But when I went on Tuesday morning, they all had it, so we had to remove them. If you're not familiar with mosaic virus, do a little research, see what the pictures look like. It is definitely something that can spread from one plant to the next. Really, the best thing to do if you suspect your plants to have it is you need to rip out the plants and destroy them. There's really not much else you can do because, like I said, it can actually spread from one plant to the next. So, like I said, we've just been harvesting so many cucumbers, so many zucchinis. We have a desert zucchini that's powdery mildew, downy mildew resistant. It has a couple other resistances listed with it, but I can't remember what those are right now. But those are doing amazing. Last winter, we actually grew those all winter. Usually during, say, November, December, January, even if it's not too cold, the days are just usually way too short for most squashes, and they get wiped out by powdery mildew. So this desert zucchini, I believe, or earliest, was December, and we had them all winter and into spring, and we even experimented with it a little bit over the summertime. They did okay, but we had a lot of issues with caterpillars on them. When we were getting back-to-back rains, it's really hard to keep the organic caterpillar pesticide on the squash plants just because it gets washed off. It is water soluble. Out in the nursery, this is pretty exciting. So I'm going to show you guys something. Where if you're tuning in, you're not familiar with us, our nursery is in Tampa, Florida. And I want to show you guys this. This is our Manoa lettuce. We have been growing it outside. We germinated it outside. We did not put it, indoors. It's not being grown hydroponics and any type of cooling systems. This lettuce is so heat tolerant, it is ridiculous. And even with the hot weather, it is not bitter at all. So tasty. So Manoa lettuce, we have a few available in the nursery, and we'll have more. We'll be planting this all winter long. We really wait for a major cool down to get the rest of our lettuces going. We did a little bit of a soil experiment where we were switching up our potting mix a little bit. And we believe that it caused some issues. That's why I'm not showing you our Jericho romaine, but that's another one that normally we would have growing out. It is growing in partial shade. We do have a clear plastic up above the nursery. It is getting some mildew on top, so that's providing some shade. And then we have a pretty big moringa right there, but it just got trimmed back, and then a paper mulberry. So that'll provide some shade on this side of the nursery. So it's not outgrown in full sun. So the other one I want to introduce you to, if you're not familiar with, this is called Mizuna. It's actually in the mustard family. It can be eaten in soups, stir fries, or even salads. It is super mild, very heat tolerant, and extremely yummy. We pretty much grow this from August all the way through about June. And if you are not familiar with this, it is definitely a leafy green that you must add to your garden. You can actually just pick at it. I don't know if y'all can see that, but it grows from out of the middle like this. So a lot like kale, we usually just kind of harvest out from around the sides. Once these get up and going, it actually will have multiple growth nodes coming out. So you don't have to be as careful with it as you do with like a kale or something like that. So usually when it's really going, I just go out there and kind of grab it like a ponytail and cut it. And it just will, it's what we call cut and come again. So real mild mustard flavor. That is just absolutely delicious. This would be a great add to your salad. As far as pests and diseases, we've been, anywhere we've had corn planted, we've been dealing with the corn worms. I've been spraying that with Conserve, which is spinosad. Spinosad is, I believe, fungal-based bio pest control, and it's actually what is in the Confortis pills that you feed your dogs for flea treatment. So you can actually use it in your yard. If you have fleas in your yard, you can put it in a sprayer and spray your yard with it, but we use it for caterpillar control. The white flies are finally gone for the most part, where they're really not tearing everything up. I believe I reported this last week, but in some of our gardens, the pepper plants are still bald because I've been picking all the leaves off of them. But they're starting to flush back out. We're really not seeing too many signs of the white flies coming. That's usually with the change of the weather and the seasons. You know, a lot of insects and insect pressure is seasonal. So sometimes if you can just kind of get through the bulk of it, or wait for the predatory insects to show up to kind of help you with your problem. That way you're not pumping through pest control. So basically, knowing the pests and knowing their season, knowing the plant's thresholds. But we've also been increasing the plant's thresholds by feeding them some of our Compost Plus liquid nutrient and Micros Plus. That actually gives, it increases the vitality of the plants, and it helps them to, it will basically raises their threshold for the pest pressure. And it either gives time for the mechanical methods that you're using to control the pest to take effect. It buys you time for the pest season to end, or it buys you time for that pest's predatory insects to show up. So for example, if it's aphids that you're dealing with, by feeding your plant with some extra liquid nutrients, you're increasing that plant's thresholds, getting them through that, and giving the ladybugs time to show up and take care of that problem for you. At the first sign of these pests, if all you do is go out there and spray pest control products, you're never really giving the predatory insects an opportunity to come, and really they're going to be able to do a much better job than you, hands down. So we want to encourage our beneficial insects in our garden. It's not just about the bees and the butterflies. There's also a lot of beneficial insects out there that help you with your pest control. Our mustard greens are up. Our regular mustard greens are up and looking good. We have not potted them up into 4-packs yet. I wish y'all could see behind me. Maybe next week I'll take the camera in there again and show you guys. It's just looking really beautiful, lots of color. This time of year, I grow a lot of leafy greens, leafy vegetables. I love those things in the garden that are really cut and come again. That's going to help you maximize on your space in your garden. Let's see, what else? We've started planting carrots, carrots by seed, just a few weeks ago. Let's see, 2 weeks ago. So this last week, I've begun thinning out the carrots. If you're not familiar with planting carrots or you're a first-time gardener, I usually just draw a line in the dirt to the proper planting depth, which is like a half an inch to a quarter inch. You don't want to plant your carrots too deep. And then I just grab some carrot seeds and sprinkle them in, try to drop them in about a quarter inch to a half an inch apart. If a lot of those seeds come up, they're still too close together. If you kind of think about the size of a carrot top, right? You know, anywhere from about that big around to that big around. That's how big they grow, and each one of those is from one seed. So if they're right on top of each other or a quarter inch apart, it really doesn't give the carrots, two carrots next to each other, room to grow. The reason why we try and drop them a quarter inch to half an inch apart is because it gives us room to get in there with scissors, or if you're early enough, you can pluck them out with your fingers. If you put them too close together, it just makes a lot of work to get in there and thin your carrots out. By the time we're harvesting carrots, they're usually an inch to 2 inches apart. That's what we're going for. The reason why we put them in so tight to begin with is because carrot seeds are notorious for not being the best germinators. So if we actually just put one seed in at every inch to 2 inches and only a third of them come up, then now your carrots are way too far apart. So that's why we sprinkle them in close together, but not too close, and then come back in the next week or two and send them out to be the proper spacing. I definitely don't recommend digging them up and trying to transplant them. There are some things that you can do that with, say beets. Carrots are not one of them. If you have done it before and claim that you're successful, I encourage you to look at the ones that you dig up and transplant. Right next to it, do a couple others like I'm suggesting, which is just kind of cutting them. If you're at week 3 or 4 and they're fairly big, you need to cut them with scissors. If you're at the first week, week and a half, like right when they come up, you can thin them out with your fingers and just pluck them out. What happens is their roots, their little hair roots get intertwined, and just the process of digging them up and transplanting them causes so much damage. They're either going to take longer to develop or they're not going to fully develop. Sure, some people could tune in, naysayers, and say that they're successful with it. But like I said, I challenge you to do a section where you do it your way and try and split them up, and then do a section right next to it where you thin them out with scissors or like basically kill the other ones. My saying here is seeds are cheap, time and space is not. So in your garden, your space is usually pretty limited. And time, obviously, our seasons are relatively short. I feel like as soon as my stuff starts producing, it's like the season's almost over. So I don't want to do anything to have things take longer. That's about it for our nursery report. Let's see what else. Yep, that's about it for our nursery report. The garden report, like I said, we've started planting carrots. Our tomato transplants that we did a few weeks back, if you've been following along, are nice big plants with flowers on them. We're expecting our first sets of tomatoes to come in any day now, which is perfect timing, right? When this weather gets perfect for tomatoes, I want plants that are already producing. If you have not planted your tomato seeds yet and you're in Central Florida, it may or may not be too late. You can still plant them if we have a mild winter. Then you're going to do good. If we have a hard winter or an early winter, that's really why we try and get our seeds planted in the end of July, August. But the past 2 or 3 years, they've just, kept going, and people who planted late did just fine. So if you're too late on seeds, and that's all you got, go ahead and get them in the ground as soon as possible. This time of year, you really want to plant your tomato plants out in full sun, just because the next 4 or 5 months of tomato growth are going to be during our shorter days, and the sun is lower in the sky. So we're not trying to protect them from sun. We want to get them as much sun as possible, and the plants will reward you with more harvest. So without going on more and more, let's get into our guest today, which is my worm farm. Hello, worm farm. So this is my worm farm. I'll be moving stuff around. Behind the camera is my daughter Ellie, and she's going to be moving it around a little bit as needed if we need to. But hopefully where it sits. I do have another one though that's empty that I'm going to be able to hold up and kind of show you guys a little bit more of like how these are built. Actually, I'll go ahead and pick that one up right now. So these are basically built out of three. Let me see if y'all can see that. 3 of these tubs. These are 10-gallon tubs. See, these are like the more shallow ones. And actually, let me go ahead and get on my full camera for now, because I think it's a little wider. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is the top 2 bins are actually built almost identical. So you can see we have drilled holes, just a few holes around the sides. I'm not going to separate these 2 because they're literally almost identical. And then I've drilled a ton of holes in the bottom. So these things are like colanders. Well, I'll go ahead and separate them. So the top 2 bins are exactly the same, and I'll get into why in just a second. And then the bottom bin, as you can see, only has holes, like, where are they? On this side right here. And then it only has a few holes right here. Okay. So basically this bottom tub is my liquid collection tub. And it also, because this is the bottom, like I said, this is always the bottom one. And these holes are for just in case it's in a location where if the lid blows off and it gets rained on, so that the 3 bins do not fill all the way up with water, so they get good drainage. So this is how it sits with the 3 tubs inside of each other. And the way that this works is we add paper and our food scraps into this bin, and this is, say, where the worms live. And as we keep adding paper and food scraps, the worms consume that and turn it into worm castings or worm dirt or worm poop, basically. And eventually this starts getting pretty full, you know, so say it's filled up to here. If I started digging around into it, down here on the bottom would almost be pure worm dirt. In the middle would be stuff that kind of looks like what it used to. And on the top would be like stuff I added last week. So what I do at that point is I flip-flop them. So now the top bin becomes the second bin. Second bin becomes the top bin. I start adding food scraps and paper into here. And because this is where the fresh food is, the worms begin moving up into the top bin and finish off everything that's in the second bin. So once I'm kind of into that rotation, the second bin is where I harvest my worm dirt from, and the top bin is where I feed. So if I actually harvested the worm dirt out of the second bin, I would leave maybe a quarter of it in the bottom. And then the second bin then becomes the top bin, and I start adding food scraps to it, and the cycle continues and continues. Depending on the type of food scraps that I'm adding, it can actually get pretty wet, and the worm leachate drips through the 2 bins that have all the holes in the bottom of them and collects in this bottom bin, which, as I said before, has holes in it just on the one side. So these worm bins sit in my carport on top of a cinder block. The holes are on, let me see, holes are on this side. Oh, looks like that one camera froze up. Oh, hopefully it'll unfreeze. Well, looks like I'm good on my monitor. Yep. Okay. So on my camera, it looks like I just froze, but on my monitor, it's saying I'm not. So there's holes on the bottom on this side right here, and this sits on cinder blocks with the holes offset just slightly, which puts it at just a little bit of an angle with the weight of that. And I keep a container underneath it to collect the worm tea or worm leachate is what we call it. And you can use that as a liquid fertilizer on your gardens. So let's get into the active worm farm. So this is a lot of fun. Let's go ahead and thank you, Beth. I can't, on my camera monitor, it's showing that I'm frozen, but on my monitor that I'm looking at right now, everything looks good. So thanks for the update. So so here we are. This is our worm bin, and we'll go ahead and take the lid off. Excuse me, just a second. I got branches on my head. Okay. So here we go. So we put in our worm farm our kitchen scraps, like our coffee grounds, banana peels, kitchen scraps for making dinner, watermelon rinds, stuff like that. I also put in our grocery bags, ripped up cardboard, shredded paper, and the worms love all of that. They love, well, it's not just that they love it. By mixing the browns, you know, paper, cardboard, with the kitchen scraps, the greens, it keeps the worm farm from getting like really gross and stinky. So here is kind of a, oh, this is kind of cool. Look, this is one of those supposedly compostable bags that I put in here. Actually, it's breaking down pretty good, isn't it? Look at that. It looks like plastic, but this is actually one of those compostable bags. Let's see, let's pull all this back. So here we got like an old ate up tomato. And down here in the bottom, I have what, probably 2 inches of worm dirt here. There they are right there. And these are European red wigglers. And I'll get into that in a minute after I kind of go through all of this. So I just keep layering cardboard, shredded paper, and kitchen scraps in here. Now, for those of you who are a little squeamish and haven't done this before, I do have to tell you, oh, there goes one, that these do get roaches. We actually, before I filmed today, took this out into my driveway and kind of took it apart and must have killed 50 roaches. I didn't want them all jumping out while I was doing this because I would have screamed and run away. Not that the roaches bother me, but 50 roaches crawling up my arms definitely would have. So, like I said, I put shredded paper, cardboard in here with our kitchen scraps. Gosh, I put so many kitchen scraps in here the other day. They already ate them all. Like I put in a whole watermelon rind. These European red wigglers have got very healthy appetites. Each one can consume up to 3 pounds. I'm sorry, each one can consume up to 3 times its weight per day. So that would mean that if you had a pound of worms in here, that your entire worm bin can actually go through 3 pounds of scraps per day. They are a colony worm, meaning they like to bunch together. And they're all asexual, but they actually prefer to breed sexually. So they basically, if they're a breeding worm, that's usually when you see that collar around their neck. Let me see if I can find one. Well, anyway, 2 worms come together and kind of rub together and exchange fluids. And basically, each worm will produce cocoons. And so that little collar around the end of the worm, I don't remember what it's called. Actually, the worm kind of peels that off like you would be peeling off your sock inside out. and then they peel that off and it closes up, and that's the cocoon. And each cocoon can contain 1 to 6 worms, I believe. Maybe it's 1 to 3 worms. And then when they hatch or open up, but the reason why, if you find them, they're not actually called worm eggs, is because the cocoon itself actually contains the egg inside of it, or multiple eggs inside of it. And it actually, the outer shell of it is just dried up worm skin that has been turned inside out. These are definitely not a native worm. So, you know, if your house backs up to like a nature preserve, or if you live out, you know, in the woods, I would highly recommend that you keep this on like a area of concrete. They don't, if they get out, they don't really get too far on concrete without drying up. But I definitely would not put one of these out near my garden, or an area where they can just get into the ground and go out, you know, into the woods. Because like I said, these are not a native worm. I've heard that there are no native worms, and I don't know, you can go down the rabbit hole talking about invasive species versus species that got here not too long ago and ones that got here a long time ago. But these are definitely not a recently native worm. They do have very strong appetites. The reason why they make such good worms for containers is where they're from, they live in the top few inches of the forest floor. They live in the forest fodder, the detritus layer. They actually don't live down in the dirt. So I have not put any dirt in this worm farm. It has literally just been kitchen scraps and paper. This is not dirt. This is all poop. This is all worm poop. Great fertilizer for your garden. So anyway, where they're from, they live in the top few inches of the forest floor, and they don't really burrow down like, say, our night crawlers or our native wigglers. And what that does, it makes them very good at dealing with quick and sharp environmental changes, because that's what they go through. If you just go and get native worms and put them in a small bin like this, if it gets too hot or too cold, they'll usually leave. Our native worms really like, if they're not comfortable, they like to burrow down to a level where they get comfortable. If you're trying to get worms for your garden, these European wigglers are not the best worms for your garden. The best worms for your garden would be our native worms. Because as they hunt for food, our native worms, as they hunt for food, and as they get uncomfortable with how hot it is during the day or how cold it is at night, they burrow up and down and up and down. And in your garden, that's really good for the aeration of the soil. Again, these worms are very good for containers because of their ability to deal with sharp changes in the environment, their massive appetites. Our native worms also, they're really going after mostly like microbiology, you know, so they're those big earthworms, the night crawlers, they're going after like little amoebas and springtails and other bacteria and things that live in the soil. These worms have a raspy tongue, much like a cat. And so they actually eat the banana peel. They actually eat the cardboard. They're not bringing in a bunch of dirt and filtering out the microbes that they need and then pooping out the dirt. That's what our native worms do. So these guys are actually eating the scraps. So these European wigglers, if you want to get into vermicomposting, that's what this is called. They really are the best worm to do this with. I've tried to do this before with native worms, and a lot of times they just leave. And just on the flip side, if you took these worms here and tried to put them in your garden, which is mostly dirt, I mean, like if you had your garden bed like covered in hay or something, they might hang out for a little while and eat that hay as it's touching the dirt layer. But once they run out of fresh food, they like fresh food. Once they run out of fresh food, they'll leave too. They go where the food is, which also makes them good for growing in containers like this. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this over or take this top layer off, move it over just a little bit, and then show you guys the second layer. So this layer right here used to look like this layer right here, okay? And we flip-flopped them. So now what we have here is just a container with nothing but pure worm dirt and less and less and less worms. So when I first flipped these over, all of the worms were in here. And as you can see, I'm kind of digging here. Oh, there's some eggshells that haven't broken down yet. Ew, look at that. That's tape from some of the cardboard I put in. We're going to get rid of that. So really all that's left in here is like some eggshells, maybe some sticks. There's is that a peach pit? But not a whole lot of worms. Not really seeing a whole lot of worms. That's good. Makes it a lot easier to harvest this stuff. So what I usually do is I'll get another container. Thank you, Ellie, by the way. You're doing a great job. I will get another container here. And then I'll just kind of start coming in and harvesting the worm dirt. And I'll just kind of sprinkle it in like this. Now, if you're doing this and you're seeing a pretty good amount of worms, rather than sitting here trying to pick them all out, I'll show you guys in a second. I'm not seeing any worms. That's great. So again, I'm going to harvest like maybe, well, I'll show you guys when I'm done. No worms. This is beautiful. Oh, we are getting a lot today. I'm going to move this over here just so I can finish this up. Okay, Ellie, will you point it back down in here? So as you can see, I'm leaving some of the worm dirt in here. On the flip side, if you're starting another worm farm for somebody or you're starting your own, if you can get your hands on this stuff right here, basically the worm dirt, and I'll take it and I'll actually smear it all around. Like if they're containers I just bought from the store, I'll smear it all around the brand new containers. And then before I put in the first round of food and paper, I kind of sprinkle the bottom like this. I took a little too much out. So we want to basically cover up the bottom like this. Okay. So now here is our worm dirt harvest. I'm going to set this aside really quick. I'm taking the container out that used to be the second container. Ellie, can you point it down right there? Right here. So here's some of that worm tea or worm leachate that I was talking about. This container has got the holes over on this side right here. And actually, when I went to go do this today, I went ahead and dumped out most of it. Oh, by the way, not only do you get roaches, but Ellie, can you get it over here? Can they see those? Yep. So black ants really, really like these things. They're not going to be as much of a problem if you mess with this thing. The more you let it kind of sit and don't do anything with it, the more the black ants kind of set up shop. You know, I'm sure you've noticed that with like potted, with your pots. If you're storing nursery pots and you have them stacked, they'll get in there. I'm crawling on my face. These ants don't bite, but they're definitely a little bit of a nuisance. If they get in my worm bin, I'll usually just kind of take the worm bin apart and move it around a little bit, and they leave. They really don't like to be places that they get messed with. So my top container, which is right here, that again has a few inches of pure worm dirt in the bottom. All the food that is left over and cardboard from what I've fed them over the past few weeks. And this now becomes the second container. Look at that. Oh, there's a big roach. Heck did it go? Well, anyway. So, oh, there it is. Got it. Squish. Okay, so this is now my second container with the worms in it. This has most of the worms in it. And then this used to be my second container that I just harvested all my worm dirt out of. And this becomes my new top container. So now I'm going to put shredded paper in here, and we're going to begin putting our food scraps in here. The worms are going to finish up what was in the second container and make their way up into the first container. And the cycle continues. Once I feel like they're all up in here and they've finished off most of what's in the now second container, I will harvest from the second container and flip them over again. I usually do this about every 4 to 6 months. I'm sure that if I fed this more often, I'm pretty bad at feeding it, relatively speaking, then you would be able to harvest a lot sooner than every 4 to 6 months. I used to, when I wanted a worm leachate, I used to pour water over this and let the water soak through to the bottom. But what I found is that I've run the risk of getting the worm farm to be too wet, which causes it to go anaerobic. That means basically all of the air and water in the worm farm that has oxygen in it, the oxygen gets used up. It begins to get dominated by anaerobic bacteria, which off-put a gas. That's what smells when you smell garbage or stinky, like tidal waters of the Tampa Bay. Anything without good flow, whether it be air or water. If your compost pile is stinky, that is anaerobic bacteria off-putting their, I believe it's an ammonia-based gas. So let me just back up real quick. So out in nature, you have aerobic bacteria and anaerobic bacteria, and they're both competing for the same food source. The aerobic bacteria have the leg up that oxygen is almost everywhere, okay? And so the anaerobic bacteria had to develop a secret weapon. And what the anaerobic bacteria do is when they start consuming the, decomposing the matter that's in there, they off-put an ammonia-based gas. And ammonias are really, really good at bonding with oxygen. So when they are putting off that ammonia-based gas, it basically bonds to all the oxygen that's in there. The aerobic bacteria are also using the oxygen that's in there. And if you don't have good airflow or good water flow, the ammonia gas builds up, the oxygen gets used up or bonds to the ammonia, and the aerobic bacteria get choked out and they die. Well, not only do we like an aerobic environment, and not only do the aerobic bacteria like an aerobic environment, but it also happens to be the same environment that the worms like. So if you have an anaerobic environment, just like the bacteria, just like the aerobic bacteria, the worms will actually choke and die. So you can always tell if your worm farm is going anaerobic because it would have a smell. I know you guys can't smell through the camera, but this has virtually no smell at all. Or if I actually stuck my nose up to it and really smelled it, it has a really sweet, just kind of earthy dirt smell to it. So that's what you're going for. If your worm farm begins to go anaerobic, that can be caused by a few reasons. You don't have enough air holes around the whole thing, or you put too much food scraps in your worm farm, or you didn't put in enough paper. The paper and the cardboard also help slow down the aerobic bacteria from consuming the nitrogen-rich kitchen scraps and using up all of the, it basically just keeps it from getting all wet and stinky. So that's it on the worm farm. We're going to now start filling this up with cardboard, paper, and kitchen scraps. But let's get into, let's see here. Put the lid back on it. I keep this under my carport, by the way. I found that that's the best place for it. I've had it in many places around my yard, and almost every place that I've had it in my yard, at some time during the year, it's in shade, and then sometime during the year, it's in sun, and it just gets too much sun. They get too hot and get cooked. So I found that under my carport is actually the perfect place for them. It's by our kitchen door, so it makes it really easy for us to jump in there and put the kitchen scraps in. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way and go to our worm dirt harvest. So here's our worm dirt harvest. When I was pulling it out, I really didn't see that many worms, but if you did this and you saw too many worms, one of the things that you can do is I'll kind of move all the dirt over to one side. And then over here, I might put in some shredded paper and some fresh kitchen scraps. And like I said, these worms are really good at moving to where the food is. So what'll happen is within a few days or a week, maybe 2 weeks, the worms will gravitate over to this side and you can remove them with the banana peels and throw them back into the worm bin. And then once you feel like all the worms are out of it, it is time to process this or put it straight in your garden. Like if you're going to store this, you want to dry it out. So one of the things that I do is I put it on giant cookie sheets, or I've used our plant trays before and just kind of put it in there really thin and leave it out somewhere it's not going to get rained on. And I just let it completely dry out until it gets all dry and crumbly. And then you can put it in bags and store it if you don't have plants to put it on and use right away. So yeah, this is a great fertilizer. It's also really good at adding good microbes back to your soil. So I can't say enough about worm castings, fresh worm castings especially. What I have found very interesting is that when I've bought worm castings before in the past, as you can see, it's kind of the consistency of like peanut butter. And when I've dried this out, it is very hard and crumbly, almost like I don't know, like chunky sand. We don't add any sand or dirt to this. What I found very interesting is when I bought worm castings before, it's nowhere near the consistency of when I've made it fresh at home. Kind of makes me wonder what's in it. I have been to a professional worm farm before, and they put out a bedding that the worms don't really consume, and then they feed the worms on top of that. I don't know for sure, but the bedding that they used looks an awful lot like the consistency of the worm castings that I've bought before in the past. So it kind of makes me wonder if sometimes when you buy worm castings from the store, if you're not buying a big old bag of bedding or whatever the bedding is that they use. I don't know if it's like a coconut coir or peat moss or what, but it definitely is not. I've never gotten my worm castings to be the consistency of what I've seen at the store. Maybe some of them, maybe they're using different types of worms and they put off different kind of poop that ends up with a different consistency. But this stuff from the red wigglers, not adding any dirt or bedding other than paper to it, it goes from being real wet, like almost like a peanut butter or a dough. It goes from this state into like a real hard, dry, crumbly, not a light, fluffy, consistency of ground coffee. I've never had it come out like that. So that's about it for the worm farm. I'm going to run really quick and wipe off my hands, and then I'm going to come back and see if you guys have any questions or anything that you want to talk about worms. But give me just 1 second and I will be right back. I couldn't find anything to wipe my hands off, so I will just wipe it off on this towel. Beach towel no more. All right, guys. So let's see what y'all had to say. Corey, hey, how's it going, Corey? Corey says poop. And also wants to know, where could we find these worms to buy? I'm going to go ahead and shut off the worm cam. you're clear. Thank you, Ellie. You did a great job. Corey says, where could we find these worms to buy? So they used to be really readily available around. There was a pretty big worm farm that was a supplier to the area that got severely damaged during Hurricane Irma, I believe. And since then, they've been kind of hard to get. I've been lucky enough that I've had my colony for going on 8 years now. And like when I'm doing a school garden or something that's getting a worm farm from me, I usually have enough to bud off of this colony and enough worm dirt to start their worm farm with. I know some people have bought them online, but you kind of have to be a little bit careful buying them. There's a couple different types of worms that are referred to as red wigglers. Hey, Richard. Thank you for joining me. You can always go back and rewatch the whole thing. Yes, it has been very interesting. Worms are one of my favorite things to talk about. So Jenny, yes, these are called red wigglers, but these are European red wigglers. So I covered the reason why it's important to get the right red wigglers. We do have a Florida native red wiggler. You know, if you had an outdoor compost pile that you just kept kind of throwing fresh kitchen scraps on top of, and you never turned it, basically like down toward the bottom of the pile, it would be, you know, it would start turning into something that looked more like dirt. And then sort of in the middle of the pile, you would have stuff that kind of looks in between dirt and what it used to be. And then on the top, you'd have your kitchen scraps. So if our native worms came into that pile and you added these to your compost pile, and again, if you never turned it, basically you would find these red wigglers right on the surface, like right underneath, like literally on the freshest food. You'd find them on your rotting mango pit. You'd find them on your tomato and your banana, eating it, like all together, squirming, eating it. Down kind of in the middle layer is where you would find our Florida wigglers. And then down in the bottom where it was dirt, that's where you're going to find our night crawlers. So that kind of gives you an idea of where the different types of worms would be in an outdoor compost pile. These European red wigglers, I'll repeat myself again, where they're from, they live in the top couple inches of the forest floor. They have raspy tongues, and they actually consume the freshest of the fresh. Kind of as it gets soft, that's actually what they eat. Our other worms, what they do is they kind of stick their tongue out and they take in a bunch of dirt and other stuff. And they're mostly processing through like microbes and protozoas and other larger microscopic or barely microscopic animals or bacteria and stuff like that. So they're really good at like taking in, almost like a whale, right? Like a whale goes and it takes in a lot of water, and it kind of filters through all that water because it's going for those little bitty krill or those little bitty fish. And that's our bigger worms, our night crawlers, that's more like how they eat. Whereas these guys, they'll actually are eating the banana peel and they're eating that tomato. So again, them being from where they're from, living on the top few inches, these are not soil worms, these are composting worms. And where they're from, they like to live in the top couple inches of the forest floor. And if it gets too hot or too cold for them, they just kind of deal with it. So these worms are really good at dealing with extreme temperature changes. And they're really good at consuming fresh scraps, which makes them a perfect contender for container worm gardening. I definitely, they like it dark. I definitely do not recommend putting them in a clear container like this. We use a darker container that doesn't let in any light. So Jan says, our Vital Earth is a local worm supplier in Apopka. And Richard says there is a worm farmer out in Plant City off of Forbes. Again, I do know of a couple worm farmers. Just make sure you're getting the European red wiggler if you're going to do container worms. If you're going to do outdoor composting or trying to get worms for your garden, you can use our native Florida red wigglers or night crawlers for sure. So I just always try and make sure that I know which worm I'm getting if I'm going to put them in containers. I've been successful before and seen people successful before with our native red wigglers, but you want to use a little bit bigger containers, and you do actually want to put some soil in there for them to crawl around in. And then Richard says, I have a barrel I turn, but I also put my fishing scraps in along with my kitchen scraps and coffee grounds. Is that okay? So for these worms, if you're doing it in a container, the only problem with something like fish scraps is they can actually turn that container anaerobic very quickly. And again, these worms, if they get in an anaerobic environment, they'll either leave or die. So yeah, anything that can decompose and anything that that they can eat that's not going to turn your container anaerobic is good to put in these containers. I've definitely steered clear of like citrus, too much bread, too many onions. I'm real slow with that stuff. I do put it in, but not a whole lot at once. But really the trick, what got me successful at this, lots and lots and lots of paper and cardboard. Because if I'm slacking off on feeding them, or if I accidentally add too many kitchen scraps, that cardboard or that shredded paper really helps balance it out. It's much in the same way where like, you know, if a horse farm or at the zoo or something, they're throwing in shredded, kiln-dried wood chips or other stuff behind those animals because it cuts down the smell so quickly. You know, they're not using like oak leaves, or they'll use hay, but it doesn't work as good as like wood chips. So basically, we're talking about carbon to nitrogen ratio. In your outdoor compost pile, you want to get that carbon to nitrogen ratio at 25:1, which is kind of a balanced ratio that encourages aerobic bacteria composting. In your worm farm, you actually want to keep it on the carbon side, as much on the carbon side as possible, because we're not trying to compost. We don't want this to get stinky. We're just trying to provide an environment where the worms can thrive and eat the scraps. So I like to keep it more on the carbon side of things for my worm farm, balanced for my outdoor compost piles. Yes, Richard, they need air. I was showing the worm farm. You can go back and watch the video. I've got holes drilled all around the containers to encourage airflow. When I was first experimenting with these, I started out with way too many holes, so got plenty of airflow, but they dried out way too quickly. So they do like a moist environment, but not too wet. So they like good airflow, but not too much. They like a moist environment, but not too wet. Once you can kind of figure that out and get a good balance of those things, you'll be successful. But like I said, doing the paper really helps out. Oh, on a brand new worm farm, I'll actually put a couple bricks in each layer. What I found with that is until the worm colony gets set up really good, it definitely helps add a little bit of balance to that environment. If it gets a little too hot or a little too cold, that's just until the worm dirt or worm castings can really build up. The bricks are in there. Basically, let's just call them, the worms are your pets and the bricks are the worm's toy. That's what they like to play with, like rocks and bricks. Exciting stuff. The other thing that that I think is really important is make sure you treat your worm colony like it's a pet. You know, it's not a garbage can. So you're not just all of a sudden one day going to be able to divert all of your kitchen scraps from the garbage can or the disposal. If you don't have an outdoor compost pile, in one worm farm, start putting them in there. It'll go anaerobic quickly. You have to give the colony time to build up. Now, what I found is like each one of these worm bins setups, the colony, no matter how much you feed it and take care of it, the colony only gets, you know, there's only so many worms that are going to live in there. And so maybe eventually in a year or two, you might have 2 or 3 of these, and then you can take care of all your food scraps. So just in the same way where you wouldn't come home and just dump dog food in the dog bowl if the dogs haven't eaten all the food yet, you know, don't just use this as a garbage can and just dump your kitchen scraps in there. So you want to be mindful. You want to make sure they have food, but you don't want to overfeed them. it's the anaerobic bacteria that you don't want to overfeed, and give the worms time to eat it. Old coffee grounds is not necessarily a good base. I do use a lot of coffee grounds in my worm farm. The base, like basically the bedding, is shredded paper. That's the best thing. Put lots of shredded paper in, spray it down. If you have somebody who has a worm farm and you can get some worm castings from them, put that in there as well. I'll use the worm castings and smear it all around on the inside. And I go real light on feeding them in the beginning, because again, you got to get them acclimated, and you don't want that worm farm to go anaerobic. So thank you everybody for joining me today. If you have any more questions, or if you're just tuning in, or if you're watching this not live anymore, you can still put questions in the comments, and I check back on my videos every once in a blue moon, and I'll answer them. But the best thing for you to do is to send your questions to info@witwamorganics.com. That will get them answered much quicker. Again, if you have any gardening questions that you want me to cover live on the air, but you can't join us live on Wednesdays at 5:30 on my Whitwam Organics Facebook page or YouTube account, you're also welcome to send your garden questions to info@witwamorganics.com, and I will bring up your question on air, and we'll cover it on the next time. So thank you everybody for joining me, and get out there and get dirty. Yeah.